welcome into another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in to today's show, and it should be an exciting one. We're going to be recapping Monday Night Football, an interesting game between the Ravens and Chargers last night. We're looking at the waiver wire and some waiver wire additions you can still make while the going's hot. Continuing with my positional rankings, my running back and wide receiver positions, and then concluding with my fantasy fact versus fiction segment, justifying or debunking certain myths, potential claims surrounding fantasy football for Week 13. But before we get into any of that fun stuff, I do want to remind you, as always, if you want to see more exclusive content such as this or any shorts that we have for our shows, consider liking, following, and subscribing to both the show and the network. Great way to really get yourselves immersed into the GSMC network. But if you want to do it more directly throughout our live streams while we're streaming our shows, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. They're a great way to contribute and interact. Or you can go to our website, gsmcpodcast.net, to leave a donation, although you can still do it here by clicking that Super Chat button, clicking that $sign, and leaving a tip of donation. Or just any questions, comments, or concerns you have along the way. Just a great way to contribute and interact with the show. Just makes it that much better. We love hearing your input, your feedback, what have you. It just makes this network that much better and makes our shows that much more interactive. But without further ado, let us jump right into our first segment of the day, recapping Monday Night Football, and boy was I wrong. Another LA team getting punked in prime time in SoFi Stadium. This time is the AFC affiliated team, the Los Angeles Chargers, losing in very weird fashion to the Baltimore Ravens 30-23 last night. And the reason why I say in weird fashion is because of the fact that this game could have been very different had J.K. Dobbins not gone down at the half. But you got to roll with the punches, and the Chargers did not do that, and thus the Ravens walked out of there with a very big win that kind of differentiates themselves from where the Chargers are right now. John Harbaugh getting the better of his brother Jim yet again. But there are a lot of different points to take away from this game, right? For the Ravens, it's the efficiency of this offense, the efficiency of its stars, most importantly. The Chargers side of things, how you look despite the fact, you don't have your big star for the majority of the game. Let's start with the Ravens, though, because the Ravens really looked a little bit sluggish to start and then got it going. And that's something that we've noticed from them throughout most of the season, in that sometimes they get off to slow starts, but they can ramp it up what with their playmakers they have to their abilities. And that's why I think the diversity of this offense is so integral to its success. Because for a long while there in Baltimore, it was all about what Lamar Jackson was able to do, either outside of structure or in terms of passing, just trying to remain as efficient as possible, because a large part of their kind of MO and identity was their run game, much like what the Chargers are now, potentially the Ravens of the West. We'll get to that in a little bit. But in terms of, acquiring all these stars, building them up, elevating their games, there's no team that's better in that regard and more confident in these players' success than Baltimore, I believe. And it comes through in performances such as this. For example, Lamar really got off to a slow start, and it wasn't necessarily his best performance. I don't necessarily think this necessarily hurts his MVP case, but doesn't necessarily help it either. I feel like it was kind of one of those mundane performances from Lamar where he did enough so that his team could kind of coalesce around him, not necessarily go through him. And that's the danger of this Baltimore Ravens team. The fact that Lamar can have nights like these where he's a little bit more composed rather than explosive, but still put up big numbers. He was 16-22 last night for 177 yards, the 2 passing touchdowns, the 1 rushing touchdown for a total of 22.58 fantasy points. And that's what I feel like is Lamar's best aspect. I feel like it's his composure and poise knowing that combined with Derrick Henry's efficiency on the ground, combined with the weapons he has, he can do certain things and play hero ball, or you can just be more control within this offense and allow his weapons to perform around him. And that's what we saw last night. We saw it from that 40-yard touchdown pass to Rashad Bateman, that Lamar can have that in his repertoire. And we saw it from allowing Derrick Henry to take more control in the latter stages of this game. So that's what I admire about Lamar Jackson's maturation as an NFL quarterback. His abilities to understand that sometimes he can be the hero, but other times he knows he has the weapons he needs to truly get going in this offensive scheme. Now let's talk about Derrick Henry's game, because he was a very integral part of this win. 24 carries, 140 yards, 14 points. Again, not necessarily a first half performance to remember for him, but definitely a performance in which he cemented his status as the most important aspect of this offense. And, I kind of feel like this is the way to go for Derrick Henry in this offense, but also goes to show that in many different scenarios for Baltimore, he can be so important due to the fact of his unpredictability. That's what I admire most about Derrick Henry, due to the fact that on any given down, at any given moment, he can explode for 70 yards or just hurt you physically. He is a very volatile piece of this Ravens offense, and he may not show up in the stat sheet all of the time early on, but just know that his impact is being felt by Baltimore's opponents. He certainly made it known, and that was kind of the difference. The Chargers lost their running back. The Ravens utilized their running back in the second half, and thus that's what got them really going offensively. So that was the big difference, even though Derrick Henry did not have the biggest game technically in real life, but mostly in fantasy. And then in terms of receiving weapons for Lamar, they were relatively quiet, but a big development here, a positive one at that, for Baltimore, is the reemergence of Mark Andrews. 5 catches, 44 yards, 1 touchdown, 15.6 fantasy points. A timely tight end stepping up here for Baltimore. And it's these 3 guys that are the nucleus of this squad that keeps this engine running and thus allows them more opportunities to develop this offense and become even more potent down the stretch. If Mark Andrews is going and ticking, and so are Lamar and Derrick Henry, there's really no ceiling here for where this offense goes, because those 3 players at their core are some of the best offensive weapons you can ever want in an NFL team right now, and they're proving it week in and week out just because of their importance to their respective squad. That's why the Baltimore Ravens truly shocked me. All their stars were working, everything was running in tandem, and they were utilizing different players in different situations, which they do better than anyone. So in that way, they truly deserve this win. Kudos to them, and I now view them as a true AFC contender. But let's look on the Chargers side of things, because here's the thing. This wasn't necessarily a terrible loss for the Chargers by any stretch of the imagination. This kind of happened to them a little bit in that Cincinnati game in the second half, and that game they proved that they can pull it out when they were getting pushed around a little bit. But in this one, it was more about how this offense looks when it's not at its best. And that's what it was for most of this game after J.K. Dobbins went down. It was not at its best. And so I can't really ding or dock them for this performance, but it is a little bit worrying. However, there were some positive takeaways for them in this matchup because of certain players who I feel can step up should this J.K. Dobbins injury be an issue down the stretch. But for the most part, the one thing that I took away from this game is that Justin Herbert in this system looks immortal without J.K. Dobbins. It's not necessarily a huge issue because you would imagine Gus Edwards can do enough to supplement him and complement him. But J.K. Dobbins is a much more physical and explosive running back in this offense. And that's the reason they rode with him for as long as they did this season. Everyone thought it was going to be a committee approach. Gus Edwards would get some touches as well. They would share the snap count. But J.K. Dobbins took over this role, and now we're going to have to see if Gus Edwards can step up in his stead. But for the most part, Justin Herbert was forced to throw the football downfield a little bit more than he wanted to in that second half to try and play catch-up with Baltimore. He was only 21 of 36 for 218 yards. He had that rush touchdown early in the game with 17.62 fantasy points, but overall, not the best performance from Justin Herbert by any stretch of the imagination. I don't know how much of it can be placed on his shoulders, just because I would feel that this coaching staff needed to come up with a better plan, knowing that they would not have J.K. Dobbins for the rest of the game, and thus that's why this performance from Justin Herbert isn't worrying by any means, but it is still something to monitor should Gus Edwards have to step in for a large portion of time. But a continued positive development for the squad is the development of young rookie receiver Ladd McConkey. I really like how he looks in this offense. A lot of timely catches in this one for him. 6 receptions, 83 yards as their leading receiver, 14.3 fantasy points. Obviously not the best in terms of fantasy production, but still someone who I really like in this squad, elevating his game week in, week out as the season progresses. And he's going to be someone who's going to be dangerous in the postseason when this team is fully healthy, hopefully, because of the fact that Justin Herbert is someone who loves to stay ahead of schedule. But when these top-tier defenses, much like what the Ravens did last night, force him into third and long situations, he's going to need reliable targets, much like what Quentin Johnson has become, much like what Ladd McConkey has become to step up. And Ladd McConkey stepping up as kind of that second option, maybe even the first option over these past couple of weeks, has really supplemented this Chargers team well. It wasn't enough last night, but in certain matchups, look for Ladd McConkey to truly be the X factor here. Let me know what you think about this game in the comments. It really shed light on a lot of different things that need to be fixed or adjusted or complemented for both of these teams. But coming up after this short break, we'll be taking another trip around the waiver wire ahead of Week 13. We're getting deeper into the season, but does not mean the importance of guys still out there in the waiver wire is waning. So you definitely don't want to miss this segment. We'll be right back after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day, I do want to remind you all yet again that if you do feel so inclined throughout the show's duration while we are streaming, you can do several things to contribute and interact with the show. You can go to our website, gsmcpodcast.net, leave a tip or donation there. Do the same thing through YouTube as well by clicking that super chat button, making it stand out. If you even want to leave a question, comment, or concern, which is very popular on this show especially, you can do that as well. It's just a greatly appreciated thing to do by the network and the show specifically. I love hearing your guys' input on all things fantasy sports. But without further ado, let us jump into our second segment of the day here, talk a little bit about the goings-on of the waiver wire. It's still an important facet of fantasy, even this late in the season. I always say it, you can get caught up, in trying to remain the top team in the league, or if you're kind of middle of the pack, you're kind of thinking you can slide into the postseason in fantasy, but just by staying in that middle guard. But the waiver wire is a big way to help you, because all of these teams in the NFL, no matter where they stand, have guys who are really showing up and showing out. Whether it just be playing for pride for those teams that aren't contending for a playoff spot, or guys wanting to show up and show up every week for teams that are fighting for a playoff spot, or even the NFL's elite teams. You know that there are several players out there who you feel should be able to contribute to your team. It's always something that you have to keep in the back of your mind, even if you think you're set up for success. And so without further ado, let's talk about some big weapons, no matter where their teams stand, who are out there on the waiver wire. Starting off with a guy I'm really liking over these past couple of weeks. Could be a very important factor into the Chiefs' postseason success and for how many regular season games they can end up winning here down the stretch. And that is Noah Gray. He is one of those understated weapons on the Kansas City Chiefs, who I just think really has been stepping into a bigger role these past couple of weeks. Patrick Mahomes is continuing to rely on him in big moments and situations. And I feel like, it could be a mirage because of the fact that because of the addition of DeAndre Hopkins, because of the verticality of Xavier Worthy, it opens things up for these guys like Gray and Watson to potentially have big days any given Sunday. But this doesn't feel like an anomalous thing. I can feel like this will continue as Kansas City starts getting, into these kind of matchups. And it's going to continue into the postseason, I believe, because of the fact that Kansas City is looking for efficiency. And I think Noah Gray is one of those guys who can be hyper efficient for this team. They're going to look for him early and often in late downs. They're going to look early and often to him in the red zone, I feel like. And he's just going to continue to see his star rise. So look for Noah Gray to be a potential big weapon for this Chiefs team. And I feel like, down the stretch, he's going to, I'm not necessarily certain it's going to be a major issue, but he's going to see a lot more looks where he's going to be in advantageous situations. It's whether or not, he can remain the reliable guy rather than try and be too flashy. That's going to be something you have to monitor, because if he's not flashy, that's where he shines. That's where a guy like Noah Gray really makes his money, by just exploiting different matchups and taking what the defense gives him. And by doing that, Noah Gray can be a very special player on the stretch for both the U in fantasy and for the Chiefs. Then let's go to a team that's kind of shooting itself in the foot, but has opportunities for certain players to step up, even if, they might be riding out the season and not necessarily trying to contend for a playoff spot on the stretch. How about Roschon Johnson of the Chicago Bears? We talked about him a little bit and his role in the Chicago Bears squad, but I feel like now is the time more than ever. When you make this OC switch to Thomas Brown, Caleb Williams is starting to look a little bit more confident in these past two games. You start to work in a little bit more of the run game, because it's all fine and dandy for Caleb to play freer. But there has to be a moment where there's a marriage between what Caleb can do and what this run game can do. And we haven't really seen that all season, no matter how good or bad Caleb Williams has looked. And Roschon Johnson can be one of those guys that can definitely alleviate pressure in the red zone off Caleb to try and be magical down there. Because Roschon Johnson's a power back. I know him from his days as Texas. Not necessarily the most explosive of guys, but someone who can be a reliable playmaker in the red zone, in short yardage situations. And I feel like if the Bears want to be competitive in certain games, they have to utilize their running back depth. I feel like I've been imploring them all season long to get both DeAndre Swift and Roschon Johnson going, and it just hasn't happened. But now feels like the most opportune time when everything seems to be getting better and looking better for the Bears offense to incorporate more run plays, because it opens up a lot more avenues for Caleb Williams' growth down the line if they do so. So look for Roschon Johnson to be a sneaky waiver wire addition for you should you pick him up, because of the fact that I truly feel like Thomas Brown is going to notice that, and he's going to say, now's the time, Caleb, and this running back unit to coalesce and work together to create an opponent offense here down the stretch that can really surprise teams as well. So that's why I'm looking out for Roschon Johnson in the coming weeks ahead. Now, another team kind of in postseason purgatory, I'll call it, in terms of whether or not they'll make it. The LA Rams, they're an interesting team in that they have the depth, they have the raw talent there needed to make that playoff push, but I think it's the secondary options that I need to see step up, particularly DeMarcus Robinson, who was even fantastic without the usual duo of Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua supplementing this Rams offense. And so, looking at the Rams down the stretch, I feel like, they're going to want to get Kupp and Nacua going, but DeMarcus Robinson's a nice supplementary piece. He's no slouch. He's someone who can be timely in his route running, someone who's very intelligent, maybe not necessarily the best in terms of explosiveness down the field, but someone who can really open up a lot of things for the Rams in the pass game, because that's what I feel like they need to do, because Matthew Stafford's been harassing these past couple of games. They need to alleviate pressure off him by giving him time to throw, and DeMarcus Robinson who can exploit these short to intermediate areas of the field while Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua work on the perimeters and in the slot respectively. So that's why I feel like DeMarcus Robinson can be an X factor for the success of the Rams down the stretch, either positively or negatively. Because if they don't utilize him correctly, they fall into this trap of stagnation despite these weapons that they can utilize as well. So, DeMarcus Robinson's importance for the Rams cannot go understated. He has to be someone who can be effective outside of these two guys that you have. And that's why I feel like DeMarcus Robinson needs to be spotlighted in this waiver wire list. And then in terms of the tight end position, not necessarily the deepest of talent pools here to draw from if you're looking for a solid tight end down the stretch. But this guy has really come into his own. He's perhaps one of the better weapons on the Tennessee Titans this year, has been for the past two, and really has developed a nice rapport with a quarterback who's still trying to find their way in the league. How about Chig Okonkwo? The Tennessee Titans, a guy who I feel like is going to really help Will Levis if he truly is the option for Tennessee. I feel like Will Levis loves guys who can take advantage of the middle of the field, because that's where Will Levis feels very comfortable. He definitely has the arm strength to go deep, but if they want to limit his turnovers, the short to intermediate areas of the field are where they need to operate, and Chig Okonkwo can be a big part of that. He has looked very good in space, but I feel like why I love him is because of the production in the red zone as well. He's a very physical playmaker, can catch a lot of contested balls in the air, win certain matchups, and obviously, in a down year for Tennessee, might see a lot bit more of the ball here down the stretch, because they are now a very feisty, competitive team that I don't really think many teams might want to play down the stretch. And it's all because of Chig Okonkwo and this big, physical, skill receiver core around him that can really mess with you on the defensive side of the football. So Chig Okonkwo is someone looking out for. Obviously, I mentioned his teammate, Nick Westbrook-Akine, and what he's been doing over these past couple of weeks. But overall, I'm really starting to like the depth and talent of this feisty Titans group. And for many years to come, as they try and collect more talent, should they stick with Will Levis or decide to go the rookie route, this team is going to become a very physical team. And it's all bred from this guy right here, Chego Congo, who I really like at the tight end position and can't ignore right now for his performances and how steady he is. But last but not least, this is a weird one because I'm not necessarily picking this team for what it stands for, what this position truly stands for. I'm picking it for the explosiveness and depth of what this Cowboys unit brings. And this is the Cowboys defensive special teams unit. I'm taking it for more of a package deal rather than, the overarching sentiment that defenses are defenses in fantasy. Because this special teams unit is truly special for what they did on Sunday against Washington. I think they can continue to do it. This is a special teams unit that's explosive with guys like Devontae Turpin. They're very knowledgeable. They're well coached. And I think down the stretch, this is a team that's really going to rely on explosive plays that can keep them in games from their special teams unit. And because, you have every right to be skeptical of the defense, know this. The Cowboys are going to be a team that's still going to be in games. They're still going to be a nuisance, but it's going to come about in different ways. And that's why I'm striking while the iron is hot here and saying that this special teams unit is going to be what propels this team to success down the stretch. So look for the Cowboys defense special teams units to be a nuisance in terms of real life and in fantasy as well. Let me know what you think about my waiver wire gems, hidden gems for week 13 in the comments. But coming up next, we continue with our positional rankings at the running back position. A lot of depth here, but players starting to separate themselves. We're going to have to see who I choose when we come back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of the day here on today's show, we'll be continuing with our positional rankings. The running back position, a position that has been separating itself from the rest of the league. And I was reading an article earlier talking about the importance of the running back position and how people view it compared to ever more important positions such as quarterback, offensive lineman, and things of that nature. And how this revolution of middle-aged running backs is starting to have people think differently about the position. But from a fantasy perspective, I'm starting to see a different narrative. I'm starting to see a lot of top-tier talent separate itself. The Saquons, the Derrick Henrys of the world, the players we talk about we know can be explosive week in, week out. But then this middle tier that's really weird to dissect and analyze just because of the fact you never know who's going to have a good game or remain consistent week in, week out at the running back position. And all four of these guys, for some reason or other, remain in this middle tier and really haven't found consistency. But in certain matchups, I feel they can be winners for you from a fantasy perspective. And so without further ado, as the season goes on, as I explain my running back positional rankings to you, you might see some players you are largely unaccustomed with seeing on a week-by-week basis perform well in fantasy, just because of the diversity of this position. So, without further ado, let us jump right into our second positional rankings of the week with my running back, starting off with a guy who defines this mid-tier and defines inconsistency this season. Without his starting quarterback to start the season, looked pretty inept and struggled mightily without him. But now that he's back, he is reborn yet again. And so that's why I have to pick Devon Achane against the Packers in a big Thanksgiving matchup. Now, the reason why I think Devon Achane, who had 20.6 fantasy points versus New England, is going to continue to shine, even in tough matchups as this one against the Packers, is because of the fact that he has become a multifaceted weapon for the Dolphins, and someone who isn't just seen as a one-dimensional player anymore, where his runs last year generated a lot of explosiveness for this Dolphins offense and supplemented the explosiveness and verticality of this receiving core very well. He truly is starting to become one of the go-to options right now for this Dolphins offense. And so that's why I feel like even in tough matchups where you expect guys like Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle to step up, these unsung guys who haven't really performed on this season, the Achans, the Jonnu Smiths now of the world, can really make their presence felt in this matchup. It's a very physical Packers defense. However, I do feel like there's going to come a time and place where this Packers secondary and defensive front most especially is going to get exploited. Just because you can't necessarily predicate yourselves on takeaways too much if you're a Pacific defense. They performed very well to this point in this regard, but at some point along the way, chances are teams are going to find a way to get past the takeaway issue and exploit you, whether it be through the running game that opens up the pass game or just attacking downfield. The Dolphins can do it in multiplicity. So that's why I feel like Devon Achane is going to have a big day Thanksgiving. Now for the second running back rather than picking. This is a guy who's also had his ups and downs this season. At one point scored a touchdown in, I believe, 9 consecutive games, but now kind of hitting a rut in his season. But it's going to be a huge factor down the stretch for this playoff hopeful. And that is Kyren Williams going up against the Saints. This is a matchup that can potentially be a trap game for the Rams, but I feel like if they utilize Kyren Williams, they will have no problems. 11.2 fantasy points versus Philly in a game where I really would have liked to see him more in terms of how they could have attacked Philly differently and this physical defense differently. But going up against the Saints, who are on a little bit of an uptick but are still struggling defensively, look for Kyren Williams to yet again be the tone setter for this offense. I feel like, the reason why this Rams offense has struggled even with the return of Kupp and Nacua has been because they haven't necessarily been reliant as much on the run game these past couple of weeks. And it's kind of frustrating if you're a Rams fan just because of the fact that it opens up a lot more for you if Kyren Williams is playing well. And so in this game, I gotta have a game, I feel like, for both of these teams, because technically the Saints are still in the playoff picture. I feel like Kyren Williams is someone who is going to be the X factor, not just for this one, but down the stretch for the rest of the season for the Rams trying to get into the playoffs. And so I can't ignore a player who is primed and ready to go for a stretch run for this Rams team that's hoping that it can get in by winning the NFC West and make some noise potentially in the postseason. So look out for Kyren Williams to have a big day, and potentially a lot of big days for this Rams team down the stretch of the season. Then for the third pick, a guy who disappointed this past week, much to my happiness and delight, but going up against another very physical defensive team, much more physical than the Seattle team they faced, which was kind of a surprising thing to point out in the Seattle success, but I digress. James Conner. I feel like, if, the Cardinals can get back to that dominant run game, this game could be a potential upset here, because I think the Vikings are going to have to be favored, seeing as to how that Seattle front got after Kyler Murray and really slowed down his mobility and his dynamic abilities in this offense. But I feel like, the Vikings can get got if a team can get going for the run game. James Conner only had 9.9 fantasy points versus Seattle. And I don't know whether this was an under-reliance on him in this situation, but it's one of those moments where you have to question what this Cardinals offense was doing in that game. Maybe they don't want to show too much for their next matchup 2 weeks down the road, but in a very physical game ahead for them against the Vikings, Look for the Cardinals to try and get back on track by getting back to what they know best. Those outside zone schemes between the tackles to get James Conner and Trey Benson in space, but specifically James Conner, because he is the guy who's the difference maker and the tone setter for this Cardinals offense. If he gets going, this one could be a track meet. They could force the Vikings' hands in this game. And this is no indictment of the Vikings' defense, but I don't really feel like it's seen as physical and dominant of a run game as the Cardinals can be. And I know that, it feels like that game against the Seattle Seahawks slowed the Cardinals' momentum a little bit, but this could be a surprising get-right game for them if they play their cards right and involve James Conner a lot more into their game plan in this one. So look for James Conner in a very tough matchup, perhaps the toughest matchup of all four of these guys this week, to really stand out. And I feel like, for the rest of the season, for as long as the Cardinals are in contention, James Conner is going to be an X factor in every single game they play, divisional or otherwise. So I can't ignore James Conner's impact, whether positive or negative in the stretch. We'll have to see in terms of fantasy implications. And then the last guy that I want to highlight in this one is a guy who I have really high hopes for in this game and really high hopes for in terms of determining how I view this team on the stretch, especially in these divisional contests, because these are the important ones for the Steelers team. If they don't win these games, then by all means they could be out of the playoff picture by the end of December even. But if they win them and they show their versatility in the offense through this guy who we know is capable of being a big producer for them, then the sky's the limit for the Steelers team. Because complimentary football is what they do, and Najee Harris defines complimentary football. He only had 7.4 fantasy points versus Cleveland, whether it was a product of the snow or just because they felt like their best way to attack this Browns defense was try to surprise them by going downfield early and often. He wasn't utilized as much as I would have liked him to in this very important divisional contest, and as a result, they got punked by a 3-8 Browns team. However, in this contest against the Bengals, in order to, keep them off the field and try and get more efficiency and effectiveness out of your offense, Najee Harris has to be an X factor. And I feel he will be. Because the Bengals' run defense, as we've said all season long, is the most atrocious in the league. And I feel like, as much as Mike Tomlin insists on trying to open up the downfield passing game with Russ and Pickens and what have you, Najee Harris is the player that I feel can be the difference in the postseason even. So you have to get him revved up and ready to go should the Steelers make the playoffs and get a favorable matchup, because this is an offense that predicates itself too much on forcing things. It just needs to relax and be one of those offenses that isn't necessarily explosive, but knows it can keep possession. The pass game is married well to the run game, and everything clicks. Because if it doesn't, that's where the Steelers struggle. And yes, you can rely on this defense because it's been one of the best in the league, and we know it has good performances in it week in, week out. But until I see consistency, not just from the pass game but the run game as well, then I can't go all in on the Steelers team anymore. And that's just the way it is. And so Najee Harris has to be an X factor. And I feel like he has the talent and potential to step up and assume a role as an X factor for this team in the stretch, because I don't feel like Steelers fans are going to be happy with a first-round playoff exit. They want a deep run. So look for Najee Harris to be more incorporated into this offense's plans down the stretch, especially in these divisional games, because the AFC North is now a division of these top two teams in the Ravens and Steelers trying not to have their seasons completely ruined, trying not to go off the rails. And the Bengals and Browns are two very intriguing spoils. And the Steelers play both of them in the next 2 weeks. So it's going to be highly integral to have a certain game plan in which you're not forcing things if you're the Steelers. And thus, that's why Najee Harris is someone who I'm looking to step up in a huge way for this Steelers offense. But let me know what you think in the comments. All 4 of these running backs, highly capable of putting up big performances. It's just about consistency and matchups. But let me know what you think about them in the comments. But coming up next, our 3rd positional rankings of the week with our wide receivers. Another very volatile position week in, week out. You definitely don't want to miss who I see rising above in this next segment right after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our 4th segment of the day here on the show, we're going to be looking at a wide receiver position, my 3rd positional rankings of the week, and yet another highly volatile position. It's a position that, week in, week out, sees these established stars maintain consistency, sometimes fall on their face a little bit, but also these unsung heroes really make a name for themselves by matchup. And not for nothing, I feel like this position is going to get the most production. It's going to be the most monitored in these next couple weeks from a fantasy perspective. So you're going to want to be ahead of the curve in making decisions about certain receivers on the stretch, because either they're going to perform for you or they're not. Because let's face it, all of these teams, no matter their standings, feel like they can get the best out of certain players. And thus, you're going to have to go with the unpredictability of that. Whether you have established stars or guys who you either picked off the waiver wire and are waiting for, or some guys who are your secret weapons, so to speak. So these 4 guys all could be in that superstar region of wide receivers, that superstar tier. But it's all going to depend on A, the nature of how their team's season goes, and B, their importance, because that's what's sticking out to me. Different teams in different situations are relying on certain performances and certain players specifically to stand out, while others, are just getting the best out of what they have. And so that's why it's so hard week in, week out to come up with wide receiver. But these 4, based off matchups, based what I think of them, and based off their performances in the past, all can perform for you this week specifically. Now further, let's talk about them. Starting off with, I believe, a repeat guy from last week's list. And I'm promising you yet again, whenever I talk about the Seattle Seahawks, this is not biased. DK Metcalf going up against the Jets. Only at 9.9 fantasy points versus Arizona. He kind of has taken the backseat a little bit to Gino's new favorite target, JSN. But in this matchup, I feel like all the Seattle receivers are viable. And DK is a physical guy. This is going to be a matchup that I'm really monitoring. Maybe not, shadow report worthy. And we'll talk about the shadow report tomorrow against Sauce Gardner. But I just feel like this is going to be his game. Because if they can get DK Metcalf going, this receiving core suddenly becomes very scary. And it's something they're going to have to rely upon on the stretch because their run game is anemic, to say the least. Their offensive line cannot necessarily run protect as they can pass protect. And so that's why I feel like, all of these Seattle receivers are going to be so important on the stretch. They might be the most important position group in all of the NFL because of their importance to their overall team success. So look for them week in, week out to interchange in terms of who I think could come out as the top receiver in this unit. And so this week, I'm going to pick DK Metcalf, even though JSN has truly shown in these past couple of weeks for Seattle as well. It's just that this matchup, his physicality, is going to come through and it's going to really, really show up against this Jets pass defense. Then the next guy that I want to talk about had a kind of quiet, disappointing night last night. And I don't necessarily think it was his fault. It's just that in terms of how this game flowed, it didn't necessarily seem like he would have to be as important as he turned out to be. Because of the fact the Chargers did go into the downfield pass game a lot, this guy really should have had better production than he did. And it's not an indictment of him. It's not an indictment of this Chargers offense at all. It's just that this guy was someone who was seen as the new downfield threat for them. And in that situation, didn't necessarily perform to the best of his abilities. But I can't necessarily put the blame on him. And now this week, going in with some much less dominant pass defense. Even though the Ravens to that point weren't necessarily as dominant in pass defense. But it was made easier because of J.K. Dobbins' absence. So I'll give him that. Look, it's a much less dominant pass defense, though, in the Falcons. Quentin Johnston's going to have a nice day. Obviously, Justin Herbert's going to have to step up. And potentially, his new favorite target's going to be Ladd McConkey because of his timeliness in terms of moving the chains for this Chargers team. But I feel like, Quentin Johnston is still one of those players who can exploit certain coverages, certain teams, and also dominate as well. So we get a comment here from Mr. George Play 01. And he's a new viewer, I believe. Welcome to the show, George. Hope you are enjoying it thus far. And he's asking me a question of his fantasy team. Sup, man? I'm 9-3, first place non-PPR league. I trade JSN and Bucky for Henry. My running backs are Barkley, Jahmyr Gibbs, Trey Benson, and Jordan Mason. His wide receivers are DJ, Marvin Harrison Jr., D-Hop, Waddle, and Amari Cooper. And I feel like at this moment, I don't think this trade should go through. And here's why. I feel like your team is predicated on depth. I like the depth of both of your skill position groups here. They may not be the biggest household names from a fantasy perspective, but they can get the job done. They're very complementary to each other, and on any given day, consistency can reign supreme with them, and that's the reason why I believe you're 9-3. In terms of those two players, JSN and Bucky Irving, they are not necessarily better than Derrick Henry separately, by any means the imagination. But together, combined, they are a very powerful thing because of the fact that JSN's being utilized more in the Seattle offense, and Bucky Irving is someone who has really been a revelation for the Bucs, even with those big guys in the receiving core in the fold as well. So look for those two guys to really shine for you. And while Derrick Henry's a special player, it's going to be more about these complementary pieces, these secondary weapons for you that you feel can be interchangeable in your fantasy roster. So for now, I'm actually saying no to this trade just because the individuality of Derrick Henry right now doesn't outweigh what I think of JSN and Bucky Irving, if that makes sense. Hope that helps, and I hope you continue to enjoy life in first place in fantasy, my friend. But I hope that helps most importantly. But getting back to these receivers, Quentin Johnston, I feel like, is someone who's going to be a no-brainer next week against the Falcons' pass defense, and I don't think we'll be able to cope with him. But then another receiver who had a decent day, I guess, against the Cowboys, but is someone who week in, week out has shown that he can be a little more volatile than we think, even though this has been a career year for him. Terry McLaurin. I feel like we need to see more out of him. He did have, like I said, a decent day at best against the Cowboys by his standards, 21.2 fantasy points. But in this kind of struggle period for the Commanders, going up against a very feisty Titans team, especially on the defensive side of the football, Terry McLaurin is going to have to really step up. This is the number one pass defense, surprisingly, for the Titans. And so, while I think it's safe to say the Commanders now are going to try and make life simpler again for Jaden Daniels, I feel like the best parts of this offense are going to come from what Jaden Daniels can do downfield, no matter the risks you have to take with that. Because of the fact that Terry McLaurin is a special receiver, and because of the fact that he now has someone who's willing to get him the ball in certain situations. And thus, that's why, even though it does not look like a simple matchup for Terry McLaurin, Because like I said, the surprising number one pass defense in the league right now. He is someone who, in this situation, knows what is going to be asked of him and knows that his team is going to need some big plays from him. Because if that doesn't happen, then there's room for stagnation for this team. And I'm not necessarily saying they shouldn't employ and utilize different players like Austin Eckler, like their running back room, but I do feel like the best moments come from experimentation downfield with Jaden Daniels and Terry McLaurin. Because if that connection isn't growing continuously, then if the playoffs come and they find themselves in a situation where they have a chance to knock off a certain team, then that could be messed up. That could go off the rails a little bit. So they need to develop this connection, trust this connection's growth, and hopefully it'll be enough to get them into the playoffs and potentially make a little bit of a run as well. Because Terry McLaurin's always going to be a guy who you can't necessarily account for all the time if you're an opposing defense. And the Titans are going to have to learn that as well, because it's not going to be a simple matchup for them either, going up against a physical guy like Terry McLaurin. So look for him to have another decent game. But decency is all you're going to need in this one from Terry McLaurin. Last but not least, A.J. Brown going up against the Ravens in a very interesting game. This time around, it's two interconference teams playing against each other rather than, teams where you're trying to differentiate within your own conference. This could potentially be an intriguing Super Bowl if both teams get there. Eagles-Ravens, man, what a Super Bowl that would be. But looking at this Eagles team and what A.J. Brown's been doing in it, he's really improved his game. I've been impressed because I've always thought of A.J. Brown as a number one wide receiver who was a little bit too vertical in nature. He's a little bit too straight and narrow. But he developed his route tree. He's getting more expansive what he can do in different areas of the field. And it's really made him one of the more intriguing weapons from a fantasy perspective down the stretch. And going up against a very interesting Ravens pass defense that can, now we've seen with the Chargers, be pretty potent. It's going to be an intriguing matchup in which Jalen Hurts has to be uber efficient. But knowing A.J. Brown and his connectedness, they're going to have a lot of opportunities for the big play in this one still. So 22.9 fantasy points for LA against LA should ramp up a little bit against the Ravens secondary that I feel can still be exploited even with that performance last night against the Chargers. That's why this game is so intriguing to me down the stretch. But let me know what you think in the comments below. I think that all these receivers are potential big weapons. But coming up next, to conclude today's show, my fantasy fact versus fiction for Thanksgiving week. Justifying or debunking big myths potentially coming up in fantasy football circles. We'll be right back to conclude today's show after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And to conclude today's show, one of my favorite segments to present to you guys every single week, my fantasy fact versus fiction. I look into some bold myths and claims this week potentially circulating in fantasy football circles and either justify or debunk them. And this week I tried to go bold. It's Thanksgiving week, guys, so I have to go bold and big in everything I say and do here on the show. But I feel like each of these predictions stems from some uncertainty surrounding certain situations, but also a feeling that certain things aren't quite as they seem, if that makes sense. I feel like some teams and situations are a mirage, and some things that we're saying aren't necessarily going to come true, or either going to be perfectly true when it's all said and done, if that makes sense. Because this is such a weird week, a lot of games going on, a lot of different days, so I'm going to try and get as weird and wacky as these games are to conclude today's show. Starting off, potentially, everyone's big kind of talking point in terms of football in general, not just from a fantasy perspective, the actual Thanksgiving Day games, because this is a slate that's not necessarily the most inspiring of slates, and it's still one, that could be intriguing, but I said that this Thanksgiving is a fantasy snooze fest, as you see this guy suggests here, being something that is not necessarily appealing from a fantasy perspective either. And while a lot of people are going to say, well, yesterday you mentioned that the Giants-Cowboys game could potentially be exciting, I didn't necessarily say it was exciting for position players. I think both of these special teams units, in this very sloppy affair, could be potential interesting pickups and sleepers in this game, but I feel like as an all-encompassing event, a lot of these games are inspiring. I think the Dolphins-Packers game is potentially the best you can get, but it's going to depend on, the Dolphins trying to pick apart that feisty Packers defense in terms of takeaways. But then you have Bears-Lions and Giants-Cowboys, not necessarily the best games in terms of overall competitiveness, because I feel like the Lions are just going to dominate in that affair. Jared Goff loves playing on Thanksgiving, and then the Giants-Cowboys, I would love to think that some guys might step up and be heroes for their teams, but it's going to be a sloppy affair, like I said. But look for both special team units to potentially give you some good fantasy points if that's a silver lining for you. But ultimately, very, very, very uninspiring in terms of games for the Thanksgiving Day slate. Potentially a nice game to conclude that day. But then, here's where I kind of got a little bit of a sense for both of these teams in this matchup, because this match was also been talked about a lot from a perspective of, well, both of these teams are seemingly headed in different directions, but I'm trying to give one of these teams the benefit of the doubt. And this game is, of course, the 49ers-Bills game, and I think it's not going to be a disappointing game fantasy-wise if Purdy doesn't play. And I feel like the reason why I say this is because this team just feels like one of those teams that can operate ably enough to compete with anybody. That game against Green Bay was kind of an illusory game where the 49ers couldn't even get a foothold in that game. And I feel like, even though there's going to be so many questions about the injuries in this one, what could have been in this one, we have to focus on the fact that this is still a 49ers team that has the belief within itself that it can compete with anybody. And whether it's Brandon Allen or Brock Purdy, this is a 49ers team that you still have to account for. And I feel that the Bills, are a team that, yes, are looking mighty fine and high right now. But there's still kind of that seed of doubt in my mind where they occasionally have one of these games where they look a little bit sloppy. And this could be it. And so I'm looking for certain details and certain aspects of this game in which it could be a lot closer. And from a fantasy perspective, there might be some hope and optimism for players who have 49ers on their rosters. So that's why I feel like this game is going to be truly bizarre in nature no matter who's the starting quarterback. Because I think it's going to be much closer without Purdy, and certainly a much more exciting game with him. But when all is said and done, a lot of fantasy production can be taken from this just because both of these teams, 49ers still with a lot of talent, the Bills, we already know what they can do in terms of fantasy coming together. And I just feel like I can't ignore this game because of all the injury woes hanging over it. So that's why I feel like I gotta say, even though it's a little bit risky here, this game won't disappoint if Brock Purdy shouldn't play. My third prediction here, even though it says, okay, I did get the right defense there. I was a little bit worried there seeing the purple. That was the Ravens defense. Cardinals and Vikings defenses were weak's best, and I think this is a fact. I feel that Cardinals-Seahawks game was a little bit weird in terms of how the Cardinals defense looked because, they allowed some big plays to happen. For the most part, they looked okay. They had that red zone pick, but that was mainly a Geno Smith decision. But ultimately, they still held Seattle to 16 points, and that might be the ineptitudes of certain situational moments for the Seattle offense right now, but it was still a performance that they can take away and say that they had some decent moments there. And the Vikings defense is always one of the most consistent, and they have to be foaming at the mouth after that Seattle performance against the Cardinals, because I think a lot of worries was in the run game for the Vikings and how they would have to defend a guy like James Conner and also Trey Benson in that unusual kind of running style that the Cardinals employ. And it could be a little bit harder because we don't know if Ivan Pace Jr. will be back for this game, the steady linebacking presence for the Vikings. But either way, I still think the Vikings defense, because of Brian Flores, is still going to be hyper-aggressive in this one, trying to get after both Kyler Murray and James Conner and really muddy it up. So look for this to potentially be a defensive slugfest that gets decided by which offense can be more efficient, which offense can be more timely. And I feel that, the Cardinals can have their moments against this defense, but ultimately it's going to be tough. It's going to have to come down to guys like Trey McBride getting open, and he did that very effectively against Seattle. But the Vikings defense is a little bit of a different breed because they've been doing this all year. And I feel like that was just a day where Seattle's defense got it right and got after Murray. And was after a bye as well. So potentially now that the Cardinals are in the flow of playing a game every Sunday, they can step up in this one. But it's going to be a tough task because of what the Vikings defense brings every week. And they're going to make Kyler Murray play hard for his win in this one. And so that's why I feel like both of these defenses have to be respected from a fantasy perspective especially, just because I feel like this is one of those games where everyone's expecting it to be a solid NFC matchup, but it's going to be a little bit disappointing because of the fact that these defenses are just so overwhelmingly good at what they do. So look for this to be a game that either way, from a fantasy perspective, goes the way of the defense or the offenses can get going here. So I'm just trying to monitor this, but for now, I'm going to say it's a fact. I'm firmly sticking it in the fact camp as of right now. And the last kind of myth that I want to justify or debunk here today is about Quentin Johnston, and I already kind of hinted at the fact that I feel like Quentin Johnston's going to continue this hot streak. Even though, the hot streak was kind of messed up a little bit in last night's game against the Ravens, he's going to pick it back up again, so to speak. So it's not necessarily a continuation because of last night's game, but he's going to pick it up again against the Falcons' pass defense, like I said, is atrocious. Yes, they might have fixed some things after their bye, but I just feel like it's going to be the same old story for them, right? They are too reliant on an offense led by a game manager at best to really supplement this defense enough to where it's not as vulnerable as against the pass. And Quentin Johnston's one of those guys who, yes, he's rolled with the punches a lot. Yes, we haven't necessarily seen that much consistency out of him. Yes, there are going to be a lot of questions asked about him in the long run ahead as the Chargers have to play more difficult games. But in this matchup, look for Quentin Johnston to stand out for his verticality. That's going to be a big thing. It's going to be a big hallmark of the potential success of the Chargers down the stretch here in very important games. Because I still feel that the Chargers are in prime position to contend in the playoffs. Just because of the versatility of this offense, when fully healthy, mind you. Because last night was not indicative of what this Chargers offense can be at full strength. It was not a performance that I can take stock in against an opponent like the Ravens because of what happened to Dobbins. And so, against an opponent that, yes, is reeling a little bit, but is still seen as a team that can compete, at least in the NFC's playoffs, look for Quentin Johnston to show why this Chargers team can be special. Because whether or not J.K. Dobbins is playing, there are going to be moments where that shot downfield is going to be available to the Chargers, and Justin Herbert's going to want to take it because he has that in his repertoire. So, even though, it could be a little bit more challenging if the status of J.K. Dobbins is up in the air for this one, but Quentin Johnston is a special type of player who's steadily improved his game over the offseason into the season now, and his lights are shining bright there in LA. And even though, it's not going to be something that the Chargers are going to want to have happen too often, it's something to monitor as this team progresses, because it's really going to grow based off the timeliness of these receivers. Quentin Johnston's truly a special one. But that will just about do it for today's show. Let me know what you think about it in the comments. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name has been Chris Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow for our last show of the week at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network. As always, make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. But other than that, for today, I am out.